The decisions utilities are making in the present aren't just about keeping the lights on today. They're shaping the resilience, safety, and economic vitality of communities across the country for decades to come. As energy demand increases and extreme weather tests the grid like never before, distribution systems have to do more than just deliver power. They have to adapt. That's something Joe Matamoros sees and works on every day. As Chief Product Development Officer at S&C Electric Company, Joe collaborates closely with utilities and industry partners to help transform today's grid into a more resilient one for tomorrow, which is a process that goes beyond storm prep or any single piece of technology. So what does it actually take to design systems that evolve with changing demands that can also recover faster when outages occur? That's just one of the things we want to talk to Joe about today. So Joe, thanks for taking the time to connect.
Oh, great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Our pleasure. So, I touched on your current role as Chief Product Development Officer at S&C, but you spent nearly a decade at the company working alongside utilities and product development cycles. Is there any one big lesson learned as part of that process in terms of how you're able to approach product development in terms of what a utility thinks they need versus what they actually need, and then how that impacts the what you're able to put together?
Yeah, so over the 25 years or so that I've been in the industry, I've seen sort of a general challenge that we still struggle with today as an industry, and that is most of the distribution system is somewhat invisible to the utility. And so there's a natural, and with technology and communications, adding communications capabilities to distribution remains the big challenge for folks. And that challenge is that across either utilities or just our daily lives, we have this reflexive push that every device that we install today should be smart and connected. And that's true across all domains, not just utilities. But when you're looking at electrical distribution systems, a lot of times the cost and cybersecurity trade-offs that you get from communications can outweigh the benefits and can really slow down how we get automation out into the field. And what we've observed, and I think it's true for the last 50 years and the next 50 years, is that in many distribution applications, many times no communications, one-way communications, or peer-to-peer communications can be faster, simpler, and easier to deploy than the more centralized cloud communications or centralized approaches that we would use in, say, transmission or other domains like telecom.
That connects to something that you've talked about, which is that the biggest opportunities aren't really at the center of the grid, but taking shape at the edge. From a practical sense, is that opportunity about embedding that kind of smart capabilities and communication capabilities to what's installed at the edge?
Yeah, it's a great question. About 70 years ago, the industry really focused, and actually power really was ahead of a lot of other industries on improving generation and transmission through communications, automation, relaying. And we've been at that for decades. And that was really important because of stability of the power system and the interconnectedness of the transmission system, where what happens at one point of the system has a major impact on the whole system stability. And so naturally, that's where automation and communications really started in the power industry. And today we have an amazingly robust transmission and generation system control. Now, over the last 40 years, we started to improve automation into distribution. And that was less about the stability and generation control that we saw, over the last 60, 70 years in generation. And it was more about automating switching so that when a temporary or permanent fault occurred, because we're talking about thousands of miles of distribution lines, we want to automate what the crews would go out there and do. Where there's a line down, we want to automate around that line down. And we've been at that now for my whole career, roughly 40 years. Now, what's exciting today is the focus was really on distribution substations and feeders for the last 30, 40 years. What's happened now in the last decade is moving automation even into the lateral. And this is where there's even more lines, even more miles of vulnerable lines to faults. And the technology and the capabilities that we have now today is really now moving that automation into that lateral. And that's really exciting as we sort of see that evolution from the grid from central out. And how you automate those laterals are quite different, because what happens on one lateral 3 counties away has really little, no impact on a distribution system, 3 counties away. And so there's less of a need for the same approach we would use in transmission and generation, and more of a need for how can we simply get automation out there for what's happening on that local line, where you don't have to have that same visibility and centralized approach that you might do in transmission.
Well, sticking with that theme of evolution and the history of the industry, I mean, historically, reliability for utility was a really straightforward concept. It was just about keeping the lights on. But I think that definition has changed with recent challenges and the bigger extreme weather pushes. How do you define and talk about reliability today?
Yeah, it's a great observation, because for decades we looked at reliability around, it's a blue sky day, my power should be on, making sure that the utility is doing what they need to do with their assets and their operations to make sure that the power's on. But when there's a tremendous event like a hurricane or storm, there was kind of an expectation of this was in a major event day, where we know the system's not going to perform as well on those major event days. And I think what I've seen changed is an expectation from society that even when there's a hurricane, we expect the power to stay on or to be restored very quickly. And this has been a big change in both how we measure things and how we operate the system. And it's really just a testament to the importance of electricity and the expectations that, like our other things in our lives, like data and other things like that, that we expect high service levels even when there's this weather events. And I think that's also true when you look at things like wildfire. In the last 10 years, that's been a growing concern around how the power system operates and how the power system can be operated to mitigate the risk of wildfire. And so I think these things are relatively new developments. They've always been there, but just the expectations on grid operators is higher now, to not just show how well we operate when everything is fine, but make sure the system can operate when Mother Nature is throwing everything she has at it, and making sure that the power either stays on or is restored very quickly, relative to what was maybe done in the past, where based upon the severity of the storm, there'd be different expectations on how fast restoration could occur.
Yeah. And what it means to turn that definition into something practical, that's something one of your colleagues, Leah Marr, wrote up in a recent op-ed, which kind of laid out how end-to-end layers of automation are really the key to grid-wide resilience, and thinking of resiliency in multiple layers is the only way that it can work at scale. What do you think about how either of those concepts can or should be foundational to larger grid mod efforts?
Yeah, so this layered approach is a helpful thought process, because, when we're back to this concept of resiliency, if the transmission system has a problem, that's going to have a huge ranging impact on thousands of customers. If a distribution substation, hundreds to thousands of customers. And so when we think about the ways to make the grid more resilient, of course, the priority needs to be on those parts of the grid that are going to have the biggest impact if they were to not operate. And so for decades, we've been hardening the transmission system, hardening feeders, things like that. But we don't need necessarily one big monolithic approach or system for everything. It's that each layer can look at what it can do to improve the reliability for the customer. So as an example, in a neighborhood, you might have an issue just with that circuit. There might only be 30 customers out, but they could be out a really long time, especially during a storm, because we're going to rightly prioritize actions that are going to get most people back online quickly. And so there are technologies now that you can apply where that layer at the neighborhood has some automation and has some resiliency, and that can just be automatic and not waiting for the line crews who are dealing with more pressing issues upstream. And the key to that is you don't need to have one big monolithic system controlling everything. You can deploy this automation in layers, so that this circuit over here, it's more susceptible. We're going to go work on that and not change the circuit over here. Whereas a lot of automation and T&D, you kind of have to do everything to turn on the system. In the case of these layers, you can go after the parts of your system that are most vulnerable and just deploy it there without impacting operations in your other circuits. And that's what we're seeing, is customers prioritizing these new layered solutions where they have the most operational challenges, rather than needing to go across the board and put a system in that controls everything. So yeah, it's also a good way of building the system so that if you have a problem with one layer, it's not going to contribute to a layer further up. And so it's just a good way of running a more resilient system, because sometimes you can have a challenge in a layer and you don't want that necessarily to spill across your entire network.
Yeah, and a lot of that directly connects to your opening address that's coming up at DTech Reliability and Resiliency, where you're going to touch on how resilience really goes beyond traditional storm prep. I was going to ask you about what's the single biggest shift that utilities need to make as part of what it means to think in this manner. But maybe we could dig a little bit into that concept you just mentioned about thinking in layers, and like, is that in terms of a technology layer, or maybe a communication layer or a cyber layer? And then to like how to break that out, as to think of it as something individually rather than, as you said, this whole monolithic system that is both impractical and just not really a reality.
Right. Yeah, I mean, things are always evolving. I think the what's changed in the last 5 years has been an increased focus on wildfire mitigation in particular, as I mentioned earlier. I think what's also changed is, when we're looking at all the things we could do with our power system, you could just plan for a long time and think about, okay, how am I going to run all this? I think at this stage, though, there's so much work to do with load growth and with the fact that the distribution system constantly needs care and attention. I think the biggest shift is, what can we do in a 5-year, 10-year, 15-year program so that, we're making progress and we're not just waiting for this miracle solution on the horizon, but we're just making progress on a daily basis to make the grid more reliable, to make operations for the line crews simpler. And I think that's the biggest shift here is just, how do I take advantage of what I can do today rather than have this sort of 20-year plan as to what I'm going to do. There's great technologies that are out there available now, and there's always a need to change the distribution system because the assets are, constantly being turned over. So I think that's what we're helping customers with, is understand what they can do now, even while they're working on longer term solutions, and not sort of paint themselves in a corner where they've put a solution in place that doesn't really work in the future. It's really helping customers with future proofing type solutions so that we can make progress today, even while we're figuring out how things may change with other constraints and other requirements on the system, whether it's data centers or fire med or things like that.
Well, and what those customers can do today, I think that connects with how you work with some of your partners to create bundled solutions that combine things like artificial intelligence and smart grid analytics to help those utilities integrate all of that. What does it mean to work with other organizations to kind of create a more holistic solution that utilities don't have to put together on their own?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I would tell you my answer would be different than if I was in 1993. Long ago, not that 93 was that long ago, but in the early 90s when automation was starting, I think customers really needed much more turnkey solutions from providers, because it just made more sense for everything to be turnkey. Today we don't see that as much, where you go to one supplier and get everything. What we see are the following: is that number one is interoperability. Whatever we're putting out on the system needs to work with other things on the system today, as well as things we don't even know about tomorrow. And so designing for interoperability versus turnkey is key. This provides the most flexibility in the future, and it allows different solution providers to all provide capabilities for utilities to ultimately make the system better. Second thing is modularity. With interoperability, that's one thing, but the other aspect is, how can I make the product modular so that I can add automation later without having to change the entire apparatus? So how can I add communication later without having to take the entire apparatus? Because we're putting up apparatus that should last for decades, and communications may not. So designing solutions that are modular, cell phones are not modular, as an example. Because they're replaced every 4 to 5 years, you just throw the whole thing out. That's not what we want to do with power assets on the T&D system. We don't want to have to change an entire asset because there's a new communication solution. So that modularity, I think, is becoming key to make sure that we can future-proof. And the last thing is simplicity. as you get closer to the edge, it needs to be simpler. It's just a basic concept because you're dealing with millions and millions of points versus thousands of points. You're dealing with systems that don't need this interconnectedness, because what happens on a distribution circuit's very different than what happens in transmission, and it's just got to be simple to deploy. What we have with our computers and firmware updates and all this other stuff is just not scalable. When we're looking at something like distribution systems, it just needs to be very simple to implement and very simple to maintain or no maintenance at all. And it's just otherwise the cost of all that maintenance will exceed the benefit that we get from that automation. And so those are the three big things for us with partners is how can we and partners work in an interoperable way? How can we design in a modular way so that we can add capabilities later? And then how can all of this be simple for the customer, reducing complexity that we see in other things like telecom and making it something as simple as, for instance, we're taking a fuse down with a product like a trip saver. We want to make that trip saver simple to implement and operate like a fuse. So how can we make it simple for these distribution systems? Again, generation transmission, different sort of situation there. But at distribution, we really feel that simplicity is key.
I'm really happy to hear you say that because I mean it's easy to get caught up in the technical possibilities and I mean the technical requirements that are associated with a lot of these systems, which there's a lot to them, but at the same time not losing track of an expectation of simplicity, of being able to say, hey, what does it look like to cut through that and install this or enable this in a way that an entire team can get their heads around without having to read a 900-page pamphlet. Like there's just a lot to that because there's inherent complexity that's going to be involved in any of these systems, but at the same time, what does it mean to make it simple and to have that expectations on both sides of the conversation, I think is important. That also connects with something else that we're going to be exploring that you'll be exploring at R&R as part of the panel discussion. We're going to be looking past AI hype to see what it means for utilities to actually deploy utility grade models right now. Can you talk a little bit about how you think of AI as a planning tool today, and then too, what it means to think of it today in that manner in a way that you're not letting what's possibly potential tomorrow interfere with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's not a day that goes by that we're not talking about AI. How can I contribute to today's discussion on AI? I would say that I like to look at history. And to me, I look at AI in context of another thing is that, it wasn't but maybe 40 or 50 years ago that a utility function would hand draw a circuit design. If we're talking about hand drawn tools with drafters and things like that. And when we went from hand drawing to electronic design, this was a huge improvement in terms of accuracy and errors and omissions and things like that. Now we have electronic drawings. Well, then we said, well, if we put those all in a database, then we can look at all those individual circuits and look at it as a system. Again, this was revolutionary. So when I look at AI, I think it's put it in perspective. I mean, we were hand drawing a lot of these things years ago. Just getting to electronic was a huge leap. I personally don't think this next AI leap is going to be as big as that first leap to electronic, but I do think that it's going to be very significant for planning, just because we're dealing with, especially in distribution, thousands of circuits with a lot of detail. And I think AI can really automate a lot of tasks that people just don't want to do in terms of data cleansing and some basic work. Think of it like as a really great spell checker for distribution planning circuits. So I think it's really exciting for planning. I think it will really help our industry be able to corral all this data that we have and do something with it. But again, I'd like to put it in perspective. I mean, think about when we had sheets of blueprints and things that were just hand drawn by draft. I mean, that we've already come a long way, and I think we should put it in context what this next journey is going to be. It's going to be important, but we've already made a lot of improvement over years.
Yeah. And I think it can change expectations too. I mean, when you have that kind of capability for planning, can go from what is a standard 10-day forecast to something that is 90 days, or I mean, just much longer than that traditional framework. Does that how does that capability impact that definition of resilience that we talked about earlier, when you have that much more power to look at everything in a way that's much you can take a longer view?
Yeah, I think for distribution, a lot of the system is set and forget. And what I mean by that is we set the system up and it's got to operate a certain way, whether it's a blue sky day or a hurricane day. And I think if we have more forecasting and more confidence in that forecasting, we may be able to have more dynamic protection and dynamic operating schemes that we don't currently use today. And I think that if AI can help increase the confidence and efficacy of that, then it creates the benefit of, well, now we should run the system a little bit differently. Now, you can't run the system differently if there's all manual gear out there. So getting back to what we were saying before about automation, if you're running the distribution system with only fuses and manual switches, even if you have a forecast, there's not much you can do with it. So a lot of what we look at is, this automation we're putting out there is an enabling technology so that if you do have these future improvements in AI, you can actually do something more with it. And as I said, a principal example would be more adaptive protection, so that you would run your system differently depending on the weather conditions and loading conditions and things like that.
And so when teams are adopting and utilizing utility grade AI and these new systems, how much of a barrier and then run into challenges, run into barriers? How much of that is about the underlying technology versus an internal culture or process that's set up, or an expectation of what that tool is going to do that maybe doesn't line up with reality, or maybe not just the reality of where the team is right then and there? And what does it mean or how have you seen those barriers be more about technology or expectation or something else?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll give you two kind of examples. On the one hand, I think our company, our customers, I see folks using AI where it's clearly solving an issue, where it's improving efficiency and team member engagement, things like that, communications in particular. AI has been very great to better organize information, it simplify how we actually craft information. And so you see that, and that's very much pull, where managers and engineers are looking at this is a new tool, like a better spell checker or a grammar checker, something like that. And so that's where there's not a lot of friction at all for people to start using that. And we're seeing that all the time. But then I'll use another industry example, which I don't know much about, but I'll use as a metaphor, is airline industry or aviation. I would just assume, and I'm not an aviation expert, that AI could probably fly a plane. I'm just assuming that you could use AI to help you fly the plane. But I think there'd be real questions on safety and security about taking the human out of the loop. And I think that's where I see the most friction is, okay, AI can really help us fly the plane better, but am I really going to take the human out of the loop or not? And then and I think that is where we see the most friction of, I could potentially put an AI agent to do something, but is the benefit I'm getting worth taking the supervision of the human out of the loop? And I think that's where the biggest adoption friction is going to be, for lots of reasons. But it's that trade-off analysis of, the benefit of the speed and cost versus the certainty and the continuity of knowing that the human's in the loop. And so I think what I'm going to expect to still see is, there's so much pull demand from engineers and managers to use AI to make our daily lives better. And I think there's going to be very little friction on that. I think the friction is really when you're completely handing the keys off for certain process to that AI agent. How do you do that in a way that we're going to be confident not having the human in the loop? And if the human stays in the loop, what's really the benefit? And so I think that's kind of that's not my subject matter expertise, just something I'm observing out there. And it is exciting, because the marketing is, you use the word, the marketing is definitely there. I think our vision for what could be is all coming into focus. I think the realities of making that happen are quite challenging.
Well, and some of that can connect to what's been an issue in the industry forever, which is the workforce challenges and what it means to bring new people into the space or see some of these roles and teams evolve. But AI is a tool to enable that. Like there's some processes where you absolutely want to keep and have that human in the loop, but then there's others where maybe that isn't necessary. But determining what needs to happen where, who still needs to be involved in and what, like that can be part of the new jobs that are defined or bringing people into the company to create those definitions in a way that should ideally create some excitement across the board.
That's a great observation because we are dealing with that challenge of how do you have a maintain knowledge in this industry. It's very learnable, but it's also very esoteric and has a lot of details. I think, AI is really sort of your co-pilot there. Sorry, I think there's a tool called that, but I mean AI is sort of helping folks rather than, changing how we do things. I think that this is something every company and organization is figuring out how to do. But in this case, I see for our particular industry huge benefits from where it's coming, but it's going to take decade to, and everybody's on a different journey there as to where their data is, how well it's organized, what they're willing to do. It's going to be interesting to see how it all moves forward. But there's certainly a lot of people and capital chasing it, so I'm confident. We will see a change.
Well, and it's going to take people digging in and sorting out what makes sense, and there's just no one answer to that. So we've touched on a lot here, but just in terms of kind of bigger industry shifts or happenings, like is there anything that's on your radar in terms of how some of these modern definitions of resilience that we've talked about, like practical impacts of what we might see, really, I mean, just define things moving forward?
Yeah, so when I think about shifts and sort of breakthroughs, I'm really excited because I feel like we actually just got through a pretty major breakthrough. And that is the following, is that, about 20 years ago, distributed energy resources started to become a larger topic, and particularly net metering and things like that. And I would say, having been in this industry, there was real uncertainty for 10 or 15 years about what our distribution systems needed to do because of these DERs. And what I have seen, is just my opinion, is that advances in technologies, regulation changes, tariff changes, in my opinion, have largely made this problem a lot simpler than what we thought it was going to be 20 years ago. And I think this is a major breakthrough because I think a lot of folks didn't want to invest in distribution, not knowing what the requirements would be for DER integration. And I think that this has been a breakthrough in technical and regulatory and tariff over the last 5 years, where now I think it's much clearer what we need to do as an industry and how we can accommodate DERs and keep it simpler. And I think that was a big breakthrough because I really do believe that was a big challenge that said, well, I don't know how I want to automate if I have to run the grid differently because of DERs. And I think this is now a lot clearer and a lot simpler as to how we do it. Doesn't mean it's easy. It just means we have confidence as to how to do it. And I think that was a major breakthrough in both technical and regulatory and policy, kind of all together, now giving us a lot of clarity.
Yeah, doesn't make it easy, but it can be and maybe should be simple in certain cases. But like being able to break that out and better understand what's what with all of that, I think is just really important. Excellent. So my last question for you is one that I love to ask industry leaders, which is to leave us with something powerful. What's a piece of advice that anchors you, or something that you think the broader sector is meeting, or even something. I mean, we already touched on maybe some lessons from outside the industry, but something that you're seeing or feeling that could folks should have top of mind or on their radar.
Yeah, I think for me, the big takeaway and the big idea is, I've often heard the electrical grid described as the most complex system ever built, and that it's changing every second. And that's a really big idea, and that can lead to this belief that this complex system needs a equally or more complex system to operate it. And this can lead to these ambitious visions and costly requirements of how this huge control system is going to be here to manage the most complicated machine ever created. And I think the big idea is that actually for the last 100 years, we've been able to, as an industry, operate this with very simple solutions. And that even if the machine is complicated, there are simple ways, especially in distribution, to make this machine work better and to meet the challenges and requirements we have today and in the future. And it doesn't have to be complex. Just because the system's complex. So that's sort of what drives me and a lot of how we think about things is how to really make progress with simple solutions layer by layer in this complex system, rather than look at the system and say, oh, because it's so complex, we need this really this amazing sort of top-down approach that's going to be on the horizon, that's always on the horizon. The ability to make great improvements is already here today. A lot of the requirements and uncertainty that we had for the last 20 years is, I think, abated. And now it's an exciting next couple decades where we're building out a distribution system that's going to operate well for another 100 years.
Excellent. Well, Joe Matamoros, really appreciate you taking the time. Looking forward to your opening keynote, which is at DTech R&R, which is going to be August 27th. The event itself is the 25th to the 27th in Chicago, Illinois. So any more info you can find at DTech Reliability and Resiliency. But yeah, looking forward to seeing you on stage and catching up in Chicago.
Likewise, look forward to seeing you and everyone else in Chicago.